So.
I'm not really sure how to follow after those last two. But,
Go ahead, sis.
And I'm quite new to this as well. This is my first time speaking to a room of people this big. So, so to introduce myself, my name is Georgia. I've been a student for the past year. I was studying a course on cultural and global perspectives in mental health care. And I wrote my thesis on the effects of racism on psychosis in Black Africans and Caribbeans living within the West. So the reason I decided to research this is that for a long time I've really been aware of the disproportionate rates of psychosis within Black communities, and I just wanted to know why this is. I've got two statistics here. The first one is an estimate that for every one white person with schizophrenia, there are almost 5 Black people diagnosed with the same disorder in this country. And below the estimate that for every one white person detained under the Mental Health Act, there's almost 4 people detained under the Mental Health Act. So, psychosis. For those who might not know, psychosis is a term that generally refers to a range of symptoms associated with psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. The prevalence of schizophrenia worldwide is approximately 1% of the population, which translates to about 50 million people worldwide. I bet in this room probably most people here will know somebody or have a connection with somebody who has psychosis or has been diagnosed with schizophrenia. So psychosis has been found to differ cross-culturally in terms of outcomes and prognosis, and the World Health Organization reported that schizophrenia has a better prognosis across developing countries, non-Western countries. So the countries they looked at were Jamaica, Trinidad, Nigeria, South Africa, Brazil, Colombia, and Ethiopia. And they suggested sort of a myriad of reasons why this could be. However, disparities are really commonly reported. For example, in America, Black people are reported to show about 3 to 4 times the incidence rate of all other groups. And in the UK, it's been reported up to a 9-fold increase in schizophrenia being diagnosed in Black people. And there's a lot of people have come up with a lot of theories about this to do with migration, to do with living in urban environments, to do with poverty, things like that. But I will point out that schizophrenia in this country is more prevalent in subsequent generations of people, not first-generation migrants. It's actually more prevalent in 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation people. So schizophrenia has been a disorder diagnosed in Western medicine for over 100 years. However, it wasn't commonly diagnosed in Black people at all at one stage in history. Medics at the time didn't believe that Black people were sophisticated enough to suffer from mental illness because our brains
That's deep.
we couldn't have mental illness, right?
That is deep.
Up until the late 1950s, schizophrenia was almost exclusively diagnosed in white housewives, up until the 1950s, and white men who were poets or artists.
Wow.
But then by the end of the 1960s, lots of Black people, particularly Black men, were being diagnosed with schizophrenia. And if you look at the time, the late 1960s, this coincided with the rise of the civil rights movement. In fact, it's documented that during this time, within psychiatric hospitals, people were having their diagnoses changed. So a Black man who originally was diagnosed as having a psychopathic personality was now a paranoid schizophrenic. And a white housewife who came in and was told they had schizophrenia now had depressive neurosis, or what we now know as depression. Following the Detroit uprising in 1967, 2 particular psychiatrists, Walter Bromberg and Frank Simon, published an article in the Archives of General Psychiatry, documenting a new diagnosis known as protest psychosis, a type of schizophrenia seen in Black men, often those aligning themselves with the ideologies of Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam, and people who were attending marches and protests. So if anybody in here has ever attended, I'm sure a lot of people up in here have attended or a march, you probably have protest psychosis. So during this time, the actual diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia was changed. So I don't know if you've heard of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. It was changed to DSM-2 to DSM-3. Hostility and anger, these 2 words, hostility and anger, became key symptoms of schizophrenia, which were the terms that Bromberg and Simon used in their protest psychosis. A 1966 article was published entitled 6 Years of Sit-ins, Psychodynamic Causes and Effects, which discussed the danger of Black people taking part in civil rights marches, stating that this could lead to dangerous levels of aggression and hostility that could develop into paranoid schizophrenia. I'm not making this up. This coincided as well with the rise of the Black Panther Party, and particularly, I think it's actually the same year that Stokely Carmichael spoke at the University of California about Black Power. More recently, however, well, fairly recently compared, there was a BBC documentary called Black Schizophrenia. I think this was in the late 80s, and this documentary talked about the dangers of migration from the Caribbean because it was causing an influx of black men with schizophrenia in this country, dangerous black men with schizophrenia in this country, because they believed that while women were carrying their babies and they had viruses, that these viruses would cause their children, particularly boys for some reason, to then develop schizophrenia. However, this was based on no scientific evidence whatsoever, and somebody just pulled this out of somewhere. But these stereotypes, they exist to this day, and it's been found that black patients within psychiatric care are more likely to be reported as violent, and they're more likely to have restraints used on them, which can have really awful consequences. I think everybody knows about Senny's Law, Senny Lewis, who died, who was restrained for 30 minutes by, I think, 6 police in a psychiatric hospital, in a Bethlehem Royal Hospital in Bethlehem. So just to show sort of pictorial representation of this sort of changing face. This was a 1948 film, The Snake Pit. You can see a white woman here. She was a schizophrenic housewife. It talks about how she got on with how she got on with her life. And then this film, 1963 film, Samuel Fuller's Shop Corridor, which featured a black man with paranoid schizophrenia brought on by the fact that he was the first black man in a white university. And another representation. These are common antipsychotic drugs. These were adverts in the 1950s. I mean, yeah, you can see who's in the pictures. And then these are the late 1960s. Saltive and belligerent and a sort of, this raised. And also the terminology used here. You've got basic tools of primitive psychiatry. These are artifacts that are actually in the New York Museum. A basic tool of Western psychiatry is antipsychotic medication. So, am I saying that psychiatry is racist?
Yes.
Yes. Psychiatry today has its roots within Western scientific racism, which continues today in the form of institutional racism across not just the entire healthcare system, the entire system, as everybody in this room knows. It's directly influenced by the days when Western scientists believed in the sort of superiority of whiteness, which they used to justify colonization and the slave trade. During slavery, doctors diagnosed runaway slaves as suffering from drapetomania. This was first mentioned in the 1850s article, Diseases and Peculiarities of the Negro Race by Samuel Cartwright. During this time, medical experimentation on Africans was commonplace, which continued into the Jim Crow era, largely documented in the book Medical Apartheid, I think. However, other mental illnesses are far less commonly diagnosed in black people in this country, so are much less diagnosed compared to psychotic disorders. A study reported that schizophrenia was diagnosed 3 times more often in black patients because the doctors believed that black patients would be less honest in their answering than other patients. So they're more likely to have a psychotic disorder than a non-psychotic disorder. As I showed earlier, black people are up to 4 times more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act. And personal accounts show that black people in need of hospital care are far more likely to be taken to a police station than the hospital. Right. Cannabis-induced psychosis. So I thought this was really important to highlight because there is this massive association between cannabis and psychosis, and this massive association between cannabis and blackness as well. Cannabis-induced psychosis was a diagnosis first introduced by Walter Bromberg in the 1930s. The same psychiatrist who brought to us protest psychosis. And he had no medical evidence underpinning this whatsoever. There was no evidence of this. And obviously, if you look at the date 1930s, it coincides with Rasta in Jamaica, the Rasta movement. And then the British introducing the ban on cannabis. And then obviously later the US war on drugs. And this association continues today in society. In the UK in the 1970s and 80s, cannabis-induced psychosis was a diagnosis almost exclusively diagnosed in black men. In Birmingham, in 1986, a study found that 27% of black men detained under the Mental Health Act had a diagnosis of cannabis-induced psychosis, and compared to 1.2% of white men diagnosed with cannabis-induced psychosis. However, there was no difference in cannabis use across these two groups. They used the same amount of cannabis. And they later found that none of these people had been drugs tested to see whether they actually had cannabis in their system, but they had cannabis.
Wow.
During the Handsworth Uprising in 1985, a Birmingham psychiatrist at the time suggested that the cause of the rioting was the overuse or the use of cannabis within the black community. You can see how this mirrors protest psychosis. Cannabis makes us riot. And another common symptom, just to point out, of cannabis-induced psychosis was this symptom of sexual deviancy in black men. Cannabis makes black men sexually deviant, which obviously you can see the sort of long-standing hypersexualization of black men to this day within society. Sort of continues from this. So yeah, I wanted to look at how racism can actually cause mental illness, not just how racism is involved within diagnosis, but how experiencing racism actually makes us more likely to develop mental illness. And there's a lot of hypotheses about this, but a lot of them are ridiculous. Things like migration and living in urban environments. And they talk a lot about multiple disadvantage, and as if these are standalone factors, as if these can affect anybody equally across society, but we know this is not true. Most of the research into how racism might cause mental illness focuses on the impact of chronic accumulative stress. And research has found that experiencing stress long-term has psychological consequences. Chronic stressors can also impact us collectively. I'm aware I have 5 minutes. And I think people have heard of the term like post-traumatic slave syndrome. You can see sort of the intergenerational effects that stress can have on us as a people. Not just the stress we experience, but the stress that our ancestors have experienced. And there's actually a lot of research into this in reference to the Holocaust, and how not only the Holocaust impacted survivors, but impacted subsequent generations. People's children who weren't directly there had an impact. So the same mechanisms could be okay, basically. This, just to go through quickly, this is the methodology I used. I selected 11 papers that looked at psychotic disorders and racism. And I used the data from the US, the UK, and the Netherlands. So these are the papers. So, in total across the 11 papers, I looked at 44,516 people. And all of the papers I looked at had focused on racism and psychosis. Some of the key things that were highlighted throughout the studies are shown on this slide. So, one of the main findings was that obviously black people reportedly experienced the most racism out of every other group looked at, and black people with psychosis always reported the most racism. So these are some of the areas that they looked at, sort of interaction with the police, healthcare, employment, which are all just facets of institutional racism. As you can imagine, there are a huge amount of limitations within this research. One of the first things I really want to point out is the Eurocentricity of the research that I looked at. They were all carried out in Western institutions by Western researchers. So in terms of their generalizability, it's impossible really to generalize this to all people. As well, I'm not sure if I mentioned earlier, but rates of schizophrenia and rates of mental illness in general are much lower within Africa and within the Caribbean. A lot of the papers also use this term perceived racism, like racism is something you can just perceive, not actually experience. Viewing racism as something only perceived serves to delegitimize and invalidate a whole lot of people.
Yes.
Many of the studies also differentiated between individual level racism and institutional racism, which they're not separate things, they are the same thing. Individual experiences out on the street, institutional, it's all the same thing, and it's all a product of a wider society, a wider institutionally racist society that we live in. Another thing, these papers can never decide on what racism is and what one definition of racism. So that's another thing I would say is a massive limitation is nobody seems to know in these papers what racism is. I think we know what racism is, but they're using their own definitions, and none of them can sort of agree on a single collective definition. They also use a lot of euphemistic terminology such as race-based discrimination, racial disadvantage, and discriminatory experiences based on skin color. The etiology and ethnicity of schizophrenia and other psychosis studies suggested as a conclusion that social engineering programs be implemented within black communities in order to strengthen the black family, as if this was going to somehow solve the disproportionate cases of schizophrenia within black communities. So, not only do I believe that racism should be considered a key factor in the increased incidence of schizophrenia, but in order to fully understand what is at play, it is vital to have an understanding of the history of psychiatry and the history of psychiatric diagnosis and classification, and the role that Western scientific racism has had to play within this. Thank you very much. My email at the bottom, and if anybody would like to read my thesis, I'm happy to send it.
Yeah, I definitely want to read your thesis.